All right, now that we've placed a JPEG file onto the timeline, we're going to do something in which we're going to place a JPEG file onto the timeline, but then we're going to set it in motion after we put it onto the timeline. And we're going to have to resize it because it doesn't necessarily fit the aspect ratio of the project. But nonetheless, I have a photo that goes really well with what was previously in the timeline. And so you see that we're previewing the previous picture. I'm moving the timeline then to approximately where I want the next photo to be. So as it turns out, I have a photo that I really want to use. It's a little bit distorted, but I'm still going to use it anyway. So if I right click and I import and I scroll down to the photo that I want to use, it's this photo down here, class number 4 is its name. And now I'm going to actually put it onto the timeline. And the first thing you'll probably notice is it's not big enough. Okay, it's just simply not big enough to take up the page. So what I have to do is and the other part, as you notice, is it's taller than it is wide. So I have to fix this a couple of different ways. So the first thing I got to do is I'm going to double click on it, and then in the effects control panel, I actually have to make it bigger so that it's wide enough to take up the entire aspect ratio of the width of the screen. So I'm going to hover over the scale number 100, and I'm going to drag it all the way until it is big enough to take up the entire screen. So now we have the image that I'm kind of looking for here. The problem is I want the image to end there when I actually go on the timeline and not necessarily start in that position. So this is where the next skill comes in, which is to use what are called keyframes to edit its position and to actually put the thing into motion during the video. Now, as you can see, the timeline up here is already set toward the beginning of the where the photograph comes in. So now I want this to actually be much, much lower, and I want its starting position to be much, much lower. So before I even put a keyframe in, I'm going to actually adjust its position, its height. And the way that you do that is you manipulate this number 540, the smaller number, and you actually are going to click and then move it to the left. And I'm going to take it down as far as it can go before it notice it cuts off there. I want it to be right there at the beginning of the timeline here. So now, how do I insert a keyframe? Because at the end of that little timeline, I actually want the person's face to be shown up top at the end of the timeline. So that what you have to do is you have to insert what are called keyframes. So what I'm going to do is, in order to insert a keyframe, it says toggle animation when I go over this little stopwatch. So I'm going to click on the stopwatch. And when I clicked on it, what appeared right here is a little diamond. And that diamond is telling you that you have taken a snapshot of where you want this position to be at that moment of time on the timeline. Now, I want, by the end of it being on the screen, I want the photo to be shifted upward so that we can see his face and the camera angle. So now what I have to do is I have to insert a keyframe at the end of the photograph here. So I'm going to move this timeline here, and I'm going to leave it a little bit short so that it pauses at the end. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert another keyframe as soon as I edit the position of this. So how do I edit the position of this? I click over it, and then I want to move it up by dragging my cursor to the right. You notice the number is increasing on the screen there. And I want it to end at about right there as the top. As soon as I unclick it, that adds a keyframe right there. So if I scroll back through this timeline in the effects control editor, what you'll hear, or what you'll see, is that we start the position of the photograph right there on the video. And if I move it forward, it moves it up and puts it into motion. And if I actually preview this on the main timeline, so here's our previous photo. So you saw in the preview pane that the video appears to go up into where the top of that position was. And that's because we inserted a keyframe and then we made a second keyframe in its final position. So basically in Adobe Premiere, from this part of the timeline to the time that it hits this other diamond over here, it is going to be in motion from point A to point B. Okay, so that's how you actually put a photograph and put it into motion using keyframes in Adobe Premiere.